In 1588, England wasn't just afraid of Spain's Armada, it was afraid of breaking. The ships were coming, rumors were spreading, and everyone remembered how quickly fear had destroyed nations before a single battle was fought. Then Elizabeth appeared at Tilbury, and she said one sentence, a sentence that wasn't meant to sound brave, it was meant to stop something far more dangerous than invasion. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." That line survived the war itself. It outlived the victory, and it's still quoted centuries later, not because it was poetic, but because of asterisk what it did, asterisk in that moment. So why did these words matter so much? Why are there different versions of what she said? And yet this line never disappears. And what was Elizabeth really trying to prevent at Tilbury? A Spanish landing, or England losing faith in itself? Because in 1588, the most important battle didn't start at sea. It started in the minds of the people who were about to fight. By the summer of 1588, England had lived for years with the sense that disaster was only a matter of timing. This was not a confident country. It was a divided one. Religious executions were still within living memory. Plots against the Queen had already proven that loyalty could fracture from the inside. And now, the most powerful empire in Europe was preparing to strike. Spain was not just an enemy state. It was a symbol of inevitability. Philip II ruled territories across Europe and the Americas. His navy was vast, wealthy, and disciplined. The Armada was not framed as a raid or a warning. It was presented as correction. England, in Spanish eyes, was a Protestant deviation that needed to be brought back into order. That framing mattered, because when an enemy is seen as inevitable, fear stops behaving rationally. Elizabeth understood this. She knew that armies do not collapse only when they lose battles. They collapse when they lose belief, when rumors travel faster than commands, when men begin to imagine defeat before they ever see the enemy. And in England, fear had fertile ground. Many soldiers remembered civil unrest. Many officers feared Catholic uprisings behind their own lines. Some wondered, quietly, whether resisting Spain was even realistic. After all, England was smaller, poorer, and led by a woman in a world that still believed war belonged to men. This is the part that's easy to miss. The greatest danger in 1588 was not the Armada itself. It was the possibility that England would psychologically surrender before Spain ever landed. That is why Tilbury mattered. Tilbury was where England's land forces were gathered to face a potential invasion, led by Spanish troops from the Low Countries. It was the point where panic would spread first if morale failed. And Elizabeth chose to go there herself, not after victory, not from a distance, but while uncertainty still dominated the air. Her presence alone was a message. She did not send generals. She did not issue a proclamation from London. She put her body where fear was thickest. That decision was already risky. Monarchs were supposed to be symbols, not participants. Distance preserved authority. Exposure threatened it. If she appeared uncertain, anxious, or fragile, the effect would ripple instantly through the ranks. But Elizabeth was not there to reassure them with comfort. She was there to reframe how they understood power, weakness, and loyalty. And then she spoke, not with strategy, not with numbers, not with promises of easy victory. She chose something far more dangerous. She chose to talk about herself. And that is where everything changes. Because the moment she acknowledged the thing everyone was thinking, but no one would say out loud, she turned a potential liability into a weapon. And the line she used to do it was not accidental. What Elizabeth did at Tilbury was not simply to be brave. She engineered a moment. She took the most dangerous doubt in the entire camp, the doubt nobody could say out loud, and pulled it into the open before it could rot the army from the inside. In 1588, a queen standing in front of troops faced a brutal reality. A large part of Europe still believed a woman could inherit a crown, but not embody authority in war. So the fear wasn't only about Spanish ships. It was about whether England's leadership would look physically believable under pressure. Elizabeth knew that if she tried to deny that prejudice, she would lose time, credibility, and emotional control of the room. So she did the opposite. She conceded it. She named it. She disarmed it. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman. That opening is not weakness. It is psychological domination, because it steals the enemy's best argument before the enemy even has the chance to use it, and turns it into a step in her own narrative. The men listening suddenly have nothing to whisper to each other, because the queen has said the forbidden thought first. She has drained it of poison. And then she pivots with one of the most powerful turns in political language. But that single word is where she flips the camp from uncertainty to identity. She does not claim the mind of a king or the authority of a king, because those are abstract and debatable. She claims something more primal, the heart and stomach of a king. In early modern English, stomach is not about digestion. It is about courage, appetite for risk, the refusal to back down when fear would be easier. She's telling them in plain bodily terms that the part of her that matters in war is not the part Spain expects to exploit. This is why the line hits like a weapon rather than a compliment. It gives the soldiers permission to stop measuring her by the wrong standard. It redirects the entire conversation from gender to grit, from body to nerve, from appearance to resolve. And it does something else, even more strategic. It makes the queen feel physically present in the same emotional space as the men who might die. A monarch could easily sound distant, like a voice from a palace that will survive no matter what happens on the field. Elizabeth refuses that distance. She speaks in the language of flesh, body, heart, stomach, so the army feels that she is also a creature with something to lose. That matters because fear is contagious. But so is courage. And courage spreads fastest when it looks real rather than ceremonial. She is not asking them to fight for an institution. She is asking them to fight for a person who has placed her own identity on the edge of the knife. The brilliance is that she admits weakness, and then converts it into intimacy. By admitting what they see, she becomes honest. By claiming the king's heart, she becomes strong. And by framing it as a transformation, woman's body, king's stomach, she becomes unforgettable. Because transformation is what the soldiers themselves are trying to perform internally. They are terrified men who need to become steady men, so she models the shift for them in one sentence. That's why the line survived long after the details of the campaign blurred. It isn't only memorable, it is functional. It does a job in the mind. It removes shame from fear and replaces it with an identity the army can carry. And the timing is the point. She delivers it before panic can harden into fatalism. A commander can give orders, but orders don't stop a collapse if the belief system underneath those orders has already cracked. Elizabeth speaks to the belief system. She's telling them without directly saying it, you are not abandoned, you are not led by a distant figure, and you are not about to become a footnote in Spain's story. In that camp, in that hour, the words are not decoration, they are scaffolding holding morale up. And here's the subtle twist that makes it even more effective. She frames herself as both exception and proof. She is saying, yes, I am a woman, but also, I contain the qualities you associate with kingship. That means England doesn't need a man to be legitimate in a crisis. England needs a sovereign who can absorb fear and turn it into resolve. Without naming it, she is defending her entire reign in one breath, because if she can lead in the most masculine-coded arena of all, war, then she has silenced every argument that her rule is an accident. And that is why Tilbury becomes more than a camp speech. It becomes a myth engine. It condenses Elizabeth's whole political persona into one line that people can repeat, teach, and remember. Even the fact that there are multiple recorded versions of the speech doesn't weaken the moment. It reveals how quickly the moment became valuable. Cultures copy what they need. They preserve the line that does the most work. And this line does enormous work. It doesn't merely inspire men to stand. It makes them feel that standing is now part of who they are. But Elizabeth wasn't finished, because after rewriting the gender script, she moves to something even riskier. She offers an emotional contract that binds the army to her personally. She doesn't just tell them she is strong, she tells them she will share their danger. And that promise, more than the famous line, may be the real reason the camp did not break. After Elizabeth fractures the gender script in a single breath, she immediately does something even more dangerous than sounding brave. She makes the war personal. She turns the crisis into a bond between her and the men standing in front of her. And she does it with language that feels less like a speech and more like a vow. The famous line doesn't end with the heart and stomach of a king. It continues, sharper, more direct, almost confrontational, because she knows confidence is not enough. Confidence can fade, but a contract once accepted becomes identity. She tells them she thinks it foul scorn that Parma, Spain, or any prince in Europe should dare invade her realm. And then she escalates. Rather than allow dishonor to grow by her, she says, "I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general judge and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field." And that phrase, "I myself," is doing heavy work. She repeats it because she needs the army to feel her presence not as a symbol but as a body. Monarchs were meant to remain distant. Distance preserved myth. Distance preserved myth. Distance preserved safety. But in 1588, distance is exactly what England cannot afford, because England's primary enemy at that moment isn't only Spanish steel, it's the internal belief that the country is outmatched, divided, and already doomed. Elizabeth comes to Tilbury because she understands a brutal psychological reality. An army that thinks it has been left alone will behave like it has been left alone. An army that believes its sovereign is emotionally and physically invested will stand differently, breathe differently, march differently. So she offers proximity as a weapon. This is what makes the contract emotional rather than logistical. She's not giving a battle plan. She's not promising that victory is guaranteed. She's promising that whatever happens, the crown will share the danger. That matters because in wartime, the fear many soldiers carry is not simply dying. It is dying while feeling expendable. Elizabeth is removing that fear. She is telling them, in effect, if you risk your body, I risk my legitimacy. If you bleed, I stake the image of the monarchy. If you fail, it will be remembered as my failure as well. And if you endure, you will not be forgotten. Because she frames herself not only as commander, but as judge and rewarder, the person who sees what you do and will make it count. Then she makes a second move that is easy to miss unless you listen closely. She manufactures a villain large enough to fuse a divided kingdom into one instinct. By naming Parma alongside Spain and any prince of Europe, she's not simply pointing at the enemy. She is compressing the threat into a single unified figure in the listener's mind. The invader who dares to touch England's borders. Parma matters because the invasion scare was never just about ships. The wider fear included the possibility of a landing force linked to Spanish power on the continent, and rumors around continental military strength fed English dread. Even after naval events shifted the situation, the country still had reason to fear instability and uncertainty, because news and certainty did not travel instantly, and the psychological momentum of fear doesn't vanish overnight. But Elizabeth's genius is that she does not describe the enemy in technical terms. She describes the enemy as an insult. Dare to invade. It's personal, it's intimate. It reframes the invasion threat as arrogance. And arrogance is something people love to punish. She's converting fear into contempt. And contempt is far more stable than panic. Panic makes you shrink. Contempt makes you stand your ground. This is a leader choosing the emotional fuel she wants her army to run on. And now the contract deepens again, because she does something psychologically risky. She invites her soldiers to imagine her fighting, not as a metaphor, as a lived event. I myself will take up arms. In practice, no one expects her to swing a sword in the mud. The power is not literal. The power is relational. She is giving the camp an image they can hold in their minds when the rumor machine starts again, when the nights feel long, when the confidence begins to thin. She is handing them a mental picture. The Queen sharing the edge with you. That picture is not just inspiring, it's stabilizing. It becomes a kind of emotional anchor in a moment when everything else feels uncertain. What makes it even more effective is the way she stacks roles: general, judge, rewarder. She's signaling that she will lead, she will interpret, and she will remember. And that's exactly what an anxious army needs: someone who will define the meaning of what they're about to suffer. Because soldiers don't only fear pain, they fear pain that means nothing. Elizabeth is promising meaning. And then, almost invisibly, she collapses the distance between the state and the individual. She speaks of my realm, my borders, my dishonor. Not the realm, not the kingdom. This is a deliberate move. It makes the national crisis feel like a personal violation, and personal violations create stronger loyalty than abstract politics. You are no longer defending a government. You are defending a person who has looked you in the eye and placed her identity on the line. This is why that moment became so reusable in English memory. It isn't only a good quote, it's a political mechanism. It turns troops into witnesses. When a sovereign appears before you and makes that kind of vow, you become part of the story. You can tell it later. You can repeat it. You can say, "I was there when she said it." Even those who weren't there inherit that feeling through retelling. The speech doesn't merely motivate, it recruits the listener into a shared narrative of defiance. And that's the rehook. Hiding inside the rehook, Elizabeth isn't only preventing collapse in 1588, she's building the version of England that will survive after 1588. A country that remembers itself as unyielding, a monarchy that remembers itself as physically present at the edge of catastrophe, a national myth that feels like lived experience rather than propaganda. But here's where it gets even more interesting, and slightly unsettling, because the more iconic a speech becomes, the more likely it is to be shaped by memory, copied, polished, and repackaged for later needs. And Tilbury is exactly that kind of moment. We have versions, traditions, recordings, transmissions, and yet one line stays almost immortal. So the question that follows naturally is not just what did she say, it's how did England turn this moment into a foundational myth so powerful that it outlived the battle itself, and why does the survival of the line matter as much as the survival of the fleet? Because the next part of the story isn't only about 1588, it's about what England needed to believe afterwards, and how Elizabeth became the center of that belief. What happened after Tilbury is where the story becomes more than a wartime moment, because the Armada crisis doesn't end as a neat military episode. It becomes a national myth, and Elizabeth's words become one of the engines that powers it. In the months and years that follow, England doesn't merely remember that it survived 1588, England learns how to tell 1588. And in that retelling, Tilbury hardens into symbolism. Part of this is unavoidable. The Armada campaign was never a single cinematic battle where one decisive maneuver ends everything. It was weather, navigation, logistics, morale, the slow chaos of a fleet attempting something enormous. But nations don't build identity from complexity, they build it from symbols. They compress confusion into meaning. They choose moments that can carry the emotional weight of an era. Tilbury becomes one of those moments because it looks like leadership in its purest form. The sovereign present, the country trembling, the words arriving exactly when they're needed, and almost immediately, the Elizabeth of Tilbury begins to solidify into a specific image, not simply a queen who survived, but a queen who embodies the country's refusal to yield. That matters because Elizabeth's reign had always been built on perception. She inherited a fragile religious landscape, a volatile international environment, and persistent doubts about female authority. The Armada threat didn't only test England's fleet, it tested whether her entire political persona could hold under fear. So survival becomes proof, not just political proof, but moral and even providential proof in the language of the time. The victory is quickly interpreted as more than strategy. It becomes validation. And Elizabeth, by placing herself physically and emotionally into the story at Tilbury, becomes inseparable from that interpretation. The message that spreads is simple and powerful. The Queen stood, therefore the nation stood. Her body becomes a symbol of national stability. Her courage becomes a public resource. This is where propaganda, myth, and memory begin to braid together. Over time, later representations strengthen the idea of Elizabeth as untouchable, composed, controlled, almost carved from certainty. The famous Tilbury line becomes central, because it offers a political formula. Yes, she is a woman, but kingship is not a body. Kingship is nerve. Kingship is appetite. Kingship is the refusal to break. Now here's the archivally interesting part, the detail that makes this moment even more revealing. We don't possess a single pristine modern transcript of Elizabeth's Tilbury speech recorded live in the way we would expect today. What survives is a tradition, versions and variants preserved in different forms. That is not unusual for the 16th century. Speeches were experienced, remembered, copied, repeated, shaped. The more a moment mattered, the more it traveled. And the more it traveled, the more it could evolve. And yet, across that tradition, one core survives with remarkable force. The line about the body of a weak and feeble woman and the heart and stomach of a king. That survival tells you something. Cultures don't preserve what is merely accurate. They preserve what is useful. They keep the sentence that does the most work inside collective memory. And this line does enormous work. It resolves the central contradiction of Elizabeth's reign in one breath. It admits vulnerability and claims authority. It anticipates mockery and neutralizes it. It transforms the Queen from an institution into a presence. That is how myths are built, not necessarily through invention, but through selection. Out of all the messy reality of war, one phrase emerges as a distilled truth about the era's emotional logic. England needed to believe it hadn't survived by accident. It needed to believe it had survived because it had a spine, and Elizabeth's Tilbury persona became that spine. Then the myth begins to generate its own gravity. Later generations look back and treat 1588 as something almost inevitable. The birth of a permanent identity, the island that cannot be forced to kneel. History is never that clean, of course, but the exaggeration is powerful, and powerful exaggerations are what nations live on. The line survives because it is more than a quote. It is a national self-description wrapped inside a personal confession. What's striking is how modern the mechanism feels. Elizabeth is doing what leaders still do under existential threat. She is managing emotional reality before emotional reality manages the country. She is preventing panic from becoming a political infection. She is shaping belief because belief shapes behavior faster than orders ever can. Spain's Armada threatened England with invasion. Yes. But Elizabeth's deeper battle at Tilbury was against the idea that England could be conquered by fear alone. Her sentence didn't sink ships, it didn't steer fleets, it didn't change the wind, but it did something every war requires before anything else can succeed. It made people believe they were still themselves, and once a nation believes that, it becomes far harder to break. And if you've noticed how a single face, a single body, a single public image can be turned into political myth, then you're already standing at the doorway of the next video we'll publish. Because Europe didn't only mythologize queens through words, sometimes it mythologized entire dynasties through their appearance. And next we're going to step into a question royal courts whispered about for generations, but rarely admitted in public. What did Europe really think of the Habsburg deformities? And what did those faces quietly reveal about power itself?